this discussion. My name is Leon Andrews, he, him pronouns. I'm president and CEO of Equal Measure, which is headquartered in Philadelphia. I live here in Washington, D.C., a native of Washington, D.C. And I'm looking forward to this conversation and looking forward to being in conversation with you. This is a conversation about understanding policy transformation as we talk about racial equity in the context of truth, racial healing, and transformation, which is work for those that have been in that world that's been led by Dr. Gail Christopher for many years out of the Kellogg, when she was at the Kellogg Foundation and beyond. And so our hope in this time together, we have about an hour and a half together, is to have a conversation initially with this dynamic set of leaders, and you'll get a chance to hear about them personally and the work that they're doing and kind of what this looks like in their world. And we actually want to create some time to be able to have some individual table where we're out in the table at the table, and you can have some more intimate conversations with us and ask your questions and what's resonating and how you're working through this, and then have a chance to then do some reporting out at the end, like kind of get a sense of where those conversations were going. So that's our goal today. Does that work with y'all? All right. So we're going to get started. So I'm going to start as I serve as moderator. I'm also going to try to bring my own personal story into the space, but it's to start at a personal level. And the panelists know this. I'm not catching them off guard. But as we talk about this work, when we talk about racial equity and systems transformation, all of us as individuals have our own kind of personal kind of story, our history, our context of how we show up to do this transformational work. That's critical for us at Equal Measure and how we try to tell narratives and understand the stories. So I asked my panel to really share with you their own personal story, and as they introduce themselves about how they show up in this work as individuals, where they grew up, and understanding the context of place and history, and how that impacts who they are today as they're trying to do this work. So that's the context for the start of the conversation, and I'm going to start with Avenel.
Hey, it was always hard to be the first one. Good morning, everyone, and huge thanks to Leon and my panelists, and in particular Dr. Christopher. It's because of her leadership that I'm in this room and even pursuing this work in the first place. So my story starts being born in Queens, New York.
I heard some Queens.
We got some Queens, New York.
My wife's from Queens.
All right.
In the house.
Born as a first-generation American to parents who came in from a small country in the Caribbean called Dominica. For those of you who are familiar with Queens, it's a very diverse urban area. Some have said it's the most diverse in the world. I had neighbors from Bangladesh and the Philippines and China, and I think this element of culture and seeing yourself represented in your community, whether that's in the library or in the doctor's office or at the restaurants, all of that was really sort of central to my upbringing. It was also really clear to me at a young age how in even close geographical areas, there were very large differences in wealth and economic stability. In one area of where I grew up, I was in Hollis, Queens. You walk from one side of it to the other side of it, about 6 blocks or so, and you go from a very affluent neighborhood with very large homes, sometimes even their own private pools, and you walk 6 blocks and you're in the housing projects. And I think that very stark, I didn't have the words for it, but that very stark disparity struck me at a young age. My mother was in the medical field, and I would see how language barriers for those who didn't speak English as a first language, or even for those who did speak English but didn't speak health language, really had a hard time navigating the public health system in Queens, New York, and how they suffered really dramatically with mental illness and drug addiction and chronic illnesses that should have been easily managed but weren't, and lives were lost and families were disrupted as a result. I was really fascinated for some reason with that sort of how these systems of healthcare or education seemed like they were built for some, but not for everybody, and that people's experiences with these same systems were really vastly different. I decided to study reproductive biology. I went and I got a doctorate in cell and molecular biology because I wanted to understand what was it about our built environments that was impacting people's health. And through my research, I found that there were all sorts of chemicals that were man-made chemicals that were in things like the lotion you use on your skin and the air that you breathe that were causing really significant health impacts. And I thought to myself, oh wow, if policymakers just knew of the science and the data, oh well, they would make policies that would protect people, of course. I went and I worked in Congress. I was in Congress for about 11 years. And I think that's when I first understood the system. And the way in which the system at the highest level of government isn't designed to respond to the needs of most people. And that science alone, that data alone, that experience alone wasn't generating the kind of policies that were protective of health or that were nurturing of a person's ability to live their best lives. And that was, I navigated that system for 10 years. I learned how to, we passed some, really great laws, things that I'm very proud of, things like expanding treatment for opioid addiction, but also really felt unsatisfied with the way that system was built. And I came to philanthropy because I was convinced that there was a different place to work where you could really take that systems level approach, where you could really analyze where some of the problems were and that you could commit to that kind of work over the generations that it takes to change it. And so I've been at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation now for about 4.5 years. I was brought on board to build a policy department to do just this sort of work in the policy realm. It's been a fantastic experience. I've learned a lot about that sector too. And that, I think that's what sort of grounds me in my journey.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks
sure.
for sharing the personal journey. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so much there that resonated and so much that resonated with me, Avenel, about just kind of the being first generation. I'm also first generation Queens. My wife is from Queens. That connected with me, understanding kind of how you saw diversity in that kind of hard, both in terms of the good, the bad, and probably all of it. So really appreciate you kind of naming that about kind of what the work is and how you show up and modeling that for all of us as we share our stories. So Tiffany, you want to give your context of place history?
Yeah, happy to do that, and excited to be here with y'all today. And I want to say that when you were talking about your story, I was like, we are sisters in the struggle here, because I mean, there's so many connective points in terms of the aha moments that we've had at different points of our careers, but also the intentional decisions that we've made to try to do this work differently than what we saw folks being able to do before we started. So I have a similar story. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. There we go. That's what I'm saying. Come on, Detroit. That's what I'm saying. Come on, Detroit, and show up for me. Show up for me, y'all. And I grew up in a time in Detroit where it was an interesting experience. In the early 70s, where Detroit was everything. Motown was happening. The factories were turning out cars, and folks were, most of my family worked for the auto industry, and which meant that you could, with full time plus a lot of overtime, you could have a great house, you could have a new car every other year. I mean, just the energy of community was just amazing. And then, right around the 80s, it took a real strong dramatic turn. It started kind of late 70s, but I would say really the 80s. A whole lot of things happened. The auto industry started to take on some hits. They started to lay off people. So folks who had long-term jobs started not to be disconnected from those jobs. A whole lot of social policies, because Reagan came in to de-institutionalizing folks in the mental health space. All kinds of issues around policing, all kinds of issues just around even, I would say, the introduction of crack cocaine was drugs have always been part of some version of some urban life, but when crack hit the city, it was like a ripple effect all across the city. You could like one block and then the next block and the next block, you could see it, where you had when you get women who are selling their children on the street, something else has happened. Like this is wait, what's happening here? And the inability or unwillingness of, I think, our health system to understand what was happening and to counter that was really dramatic. I mean, it was like night and day. And then the whole series of things, and I saw the city just lose its vitality and its energy. It was like overnight. And as a young person growing up in that environment, I just felt like I had a responsibility to try to fix it, right? I didn't know how I wanted to fix it. So like you, I went off, I said, all right, I'm going to try to figure out how to get enough education to figure out how it is that Detroit as a city can be as prosperous and successful as some of these other places. And to address some of what I didn't know back then it was narrative, but the narrative issues when you got Ronald Reagan at the time saying things about, welfare moms and welfare queens, and these people don't want to work. And I'm like, all of my family working every day, 2 or 3 jobs, overtime.
Right.
I mean, what are you talking about? Like, who are you describing? And so I didn't understand I didn't quite understand what to do, but I thought at the very least I can go get enough education to figure something out. And I went to study community economic development and public policy. And like Avenel, I thought that data would be enough. Like if I could just go and get enough data, I did, of public policy and economics. I had all my little multi-level modeling, right? So I can see if you invest in the power and capacity of people in our communities, here's what the impacts are. Not only do you get a direct return on the investment, like you can show all these social programs, literally direct investment. You put $1 here, you get $10 back. I mean, literally, you could show that. But also, you could show the social returns. People get healthier. The community gets stronger. People start, all kinds of social goods, right? Kids get educated. Like, we get more jobs. We get more industry. We get more technology. We get all these positive things. I thought if I could just do the analysis to show that like, policymakers would be saying, oh, my God, we've been so silly. Oh, my God, we got it. Look at this, right? And so that's what I went off to do. And I did all this stuff. And, and I realized it was interesting. There was almost a direct, counterintuitive relationship. The more data we had, the more foolish we were acting. Really, in terms of social policy. Like, what? I'm sorry, we have more data than ever to be able to show the benefit of the work that we do in community. And at the same time, that's when you make the decision to be real stupid and defund everything. I don't even understand the relationship. And so for me, it meant figuring out what was happening. Now, we know what was happening in this room, but also figuring out ways to counteract that. So I started to invest my time and talent and energy into figuring out systems that were important to communities. I did a stint in private sector, public sector, but noticeably, I think in the health space, I went to work for the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and because I wanted to learn like what was the decision making power and capacity of these institutions. Like, what is it that you need to do to start to shift? Same thing in HUD. Like, what is it that you need to know from a structural standpoint that helps to shift resources and make decisions that are different? And I went in as a sort of data person, like doing a lot of the data analysts. And first of all, one of the things I noticed from working from, for example, HHS, is that we had mandated reports that we had to do that went to the Congress. One of them still, I have good friends at HHS right now, they still produce reports like this. One of them called Welfare Dependency in America. And it's all of these charts. I mean, it's like this. They produce it every year, reported back to Congress about all the social programs that are quote unquote welfare dependency that represent, right? And I'm like, what are the real programs that are welfare dependent? Sort of corporate welfare, the kind of stuff that like. Well, let me back up. Start the preaching. We're all dependent on government. All of us. The fact that your trash gets picked up, the fact that your water works and is right. Every part of your life is dependent on government. But to say that you're going to have a specific report that only looks at the programs, right, that are about keeping low-income families afloat, that are about the programs that serve mostly people of color, and you're going to put that out as dependency, really, right? it in and of itself, just the framing of that, right, automated the response that you got on Capitol Hill. Automated that. That was a whole different conversation about, even at HUD and working a little bit from HUD, same thing. You had all the conversation about these social programs and who's dependent on this. And the largest dependency we have in terms of housing subsidy is the mortgage interest deduction. And that does not mostly benefit, right, communities of color. And it does not benefit, right? It benefits a whole lot of other people, but you never hear talked about in that context. And so that really, I would say, was the predecessor for the work that I do at TheCaseMade, which is an organization I founded 5 years ago. Is that we've got to get underneath not just narrative change, but to understand what it takes to drive systems change, to understand the structures and how they're built. I mean, one of the challenges for us as advocates is that we know the vision of the future we want, but we don't understand the systems and how they're built so that we can dismantle them, right, thoughtfully, and to do that in a way that uses narrative and the power of our voices to shift that. I think that we need a lot more of that so that the asks that we're making show up in ways that actually change policy. And it's tough. And so a lot of the work that we do at TheCaseMade is having folks do that, figuring out what were you trying to change. Well, I can say that if you go ask the mayor, you can ask the mayor. But let me tell you that the real decision making is not happening in that public forum that you just spent a whole lot of time preparing for. Right. There's nothing wrong with going to those meetings. We have to show up and let people hear our voices. But the decisions that are made around about our health system and our housing systems and our education systems are not made in that room. Let's talk about the rooms that are made in and how we get entry into those. And what's the case that you got to make to be able to do that, right? To be able to have folks show up differently in those conversations. And it's tough because sometimes, like I say, the arguments that we're making here in our conversations here, not always the arguments that will show up in that conversation. So how do we stay true to the authenticity of what we need to say, but say it so folks can hear it so that we get the reception that we need and we get folks to lean into the work that we need to do. So I'll stop there, but I think, our struggles have been the same, and probably you're going to say some similar version of that, making the aha moment that what we're looking at doesn't quite line up with what we need and how to figure out strategies for strengthening the capacity of our field to show up in really powerful ways.
Wow. Thank you for all of that. So much to, I'm obviously taking a lot of notes as I'm listening to tell your stories and to hear you talk about your journey from Detroit, right? A city that was booming with Black excellence, like within the 70s, another period of time, and you seeing that Black excellence, but then also seeing the impact of the change of so many things that happened, from the economy, from the auto industry, policies from Reagan to the crack, and how that has impacted the narratives and the policy, how those policies have impacted those same communities. To then talking about, you feeling like, what can I do to change it? And all of us coming in with this wide-eyed optimism. Like, if only people knew the answers, like if they knew it, maybe that would be enough to change it. And all of us trying to choose, like, what's that path that we're taking to do that, and whether it's whatever educational path that we thought would get us there, and then to realize the reality, like, oh, that ain't it. There's more to it than just giving them the data, and then us trying to figure out how we navigate that world to still make a difference. To then talking about the work you do with the driving that narrative and realizing how people are using narrative to kind of reinforce it. Just love it. I'm just sitting with all of that. It's just a great appreciation for y'all bringing that. Thanks for setting the tone. And Tambra, I'm going to turn it over to you to continue to share kind of your own personal history, your context, and your narrative.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm a proud Ward 8 resident. I'm currently a PhD candidate at American University School of Communication, but my story didn't start there. It started in Oklahoma. I'm fifth generation Oklahoman. And I see the... No problem. Yeah, next year we'll invest in real microphones. But I will try to project. Say it loud, say it proud. So I appreciate the narratives that have been shared, because even though we have a golden thread that binds us, the reality is we, even as Black women, are not monolithic. And that's the essence of even my dissertation research that looks at Black women's health from a communication perspective, specifically in the area of belonging, and how does belonging in online communities shape our physical and psychological health. But before I got to that place, because it was kind of like coming out of the closet, I had no thought to even center us. Because in how in which I grew up, there was no centering of Black people, Black women. And so being at the margins is how I existed. And it really took understanding, leaving Oklahoma, to understand and reflect, what did I just go through? What have my family gone through? We talked about Black excellence in the 70s in Detroit. Before there was ever a Detroit Black excellence, there was Boley, Oklahoma, that Booker T. Washington wrote about in his journeys and as he went on to help build Tuskegee. And so for me, the delusion of America and what it represents in white nation building is very clear. Growing up in a state that once was blue, that turned red, but always has a Dixiecrat vibe underneath the undertones, where I didn't know about Tulsa Race Massacre until I left Oklahoma, because not even in our textbooks of Oklahoma history was my history in those books. And so even though my family went through that, or Mayor of Rentonville, where John Hope Franklin came out of, no one ever talked about that, even in our family reunions. And so to me, it's so critically clear that why I'm in education is because I value being a lifelong learner. I'm continuously learning about my journey, my life, new family members. Well, I never married anybody back home. You might marry a cousin. It's real. It's real. And so for me, the 4 or 5 F's of Oklahoma is faith, food, family, freedom, and football. And so when I think about the context of where I am now, I did a piece, invited to do a piece, features guest editor for Eating Well last year, on a piece I entitled African Heritage Diet as Medicine, How Black Food Can Heal the Community. But it centered my 2 grandmas on my maternal paternal side that lived within less than a mile away in Northeast Oklahoma City, but yet they had 2 different very outcomes. Both married, both had children. One was a nurse, one was an educator, but one dealt with childhood trauma, ultimately that involved a high school principal that gave birth to one of her daughters, who we later learned my aunt. And I had a similar history of not knowing my own father and understanding me and my sister had the same name, 2 different fathers. And I only knew mine until college, and then died 6 years later in a head-on collision just 3 days before his birthday. And how that really did shape and redirect my path. And so when I talked about my grandmas in that piece, that both had diabetes, but one was a chain smoker, one was sedentary. I know she dealt with shock therapy. I didn't know until my adulthood. And so I understood she was self-medicating between the smoking and the sweets. And she had, what financial independence did she have? You know, when we think about, we say we're so proud of long Black marriages, and having now centered gender equity research, I mean, where was she going to go? Where was she going to go, even if she wanted to leave? But my granddad, who I appreciated and valued, like, you just never know what Black women and what women people go through in general. And so I don't like to romanticize history. I like to understand the history to know how can we move forward better together in that history. And so that's why now I go back with a lens of being a storyteller. I'm going back in August. You know, our family very much still competes in the rodeos. I'll be going to Okmulgee, going to Tulsa to do a sisterhood supper to bring Black women and food together to help raise funds for our WANDA Endowed Scholarship I created at Oklahoma State, where I went to school for nutrition. But right now we have anti-DE laws. So in essence, the kind of scholarship I created that the Oshie Foundation is managing, if it wasn't privatized by us, it could be on the chopping block. And so even just bringing visibility, I have a bit of trepidation in that as well around this, because it squarely goes to Black women in agriculture and nutrition back home, an area, a field that, even though that's what brought my ancestor Giles Burkhalter to Oklahoma out of Corsicana, Texas, 5 generations ago, I had no desire to ever be in that field because of the narratives that had been shaped around it. But it really was realizing that everything that I saw as my pain point, as my weakness, became my superpower. And so that is what now has manifested the creation of WANDA, Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. I started to see in the midst of the Let's Move initiative, chefs rise up to the occasion, being centered. But I'm like, I knew women being in the kitchen cooking. And so I realized this was a displace of power and privilege and profiteering at its best. And then the chefs I knew mostly had diabetes. So make this make sense. And so I thought, once Michelle leaves, who's going to continue to pick up the torch? I said, well, one group of people I know that should be are the food heroes that we know, our mamas, our aunties, our nanas, our sisters, our daughters. And to give them that platform, that pipeline that they deserve to no longer be these hidden figures in the food system. While I learned about, and being a botany bench nutritionist or whatever, doing research, I later realized the importance of the humanities of food, how it helps to contextualize and understand how, even though our grandmothers were cooking back south, the recipes were taken, they were profiteered by those who owned them or contracted their work. And so you began to realize this economic inequities that tie into food and ultimately tie into health. And so as I make these connections, I literally sit at the intersection of food, health, race, gender, comms, and policy, because it became clear, even though I came in like others, going from research, going to policy, working at HHS, then commerce, a minority business, I wanted to begin to understand the health-wealth connection, knowing that we generated wealth back home in Oklahoma, but as the research shows, data sometimes isn't always collected for our benefit. It's actually for our detriment, to be monitored and managed and make sure we don't go looking for the promised land too far. And so we sometimes have to understand the role that I've seen data be used as a weapon, not a tool of liberation. And so I think qualifying how in which we use data is so vitally important. And so when I think about where I am now in my journey and why I chose communication versus I really pontificated, why not a PhD in nutrition or public health? I was like, I need to widen my range of tools. My tools are limited. I remember a Tufts alum in Boston saying that the people who make a difference in health will come out of health. And that sat with me. And I was like, what does he mean by that? And I see the role that technology has played in this, the role of economic development has played, how it actually can harm the culture of health if they're not having a seat at the table. And so in the midst of all the conversations I've been sitting at around food as medicine, I saw this same dynamic happening. We're the beneficiary poster child, other people profiteering off Black bodies, and therefore we're not seeing Black entrepreneurship to understand that if you invest in those who create economic opportunities and jobs in the context of culture and health, perhaps maybe we can change the trajectory of how we move forward. And so that's why I pitched the idea to a few partners last year, including Hopkins, around what if we had a food as medicine in the Black community gathering that really understood the importance of centering not only Black people, Black jobs and businesses, but actually our Black food. And I say this in the midst of food as medicine is really sitting on the Mediterranean diet platform. And having talked to the people in that space, they talk about it in a way as if, oh, we can just apply Mediterranean diet to like Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans and just, remix the recipes using Mediterranean diet. I'm like, if no one ever took humanities or sociology, we still call that centering whiteness. You know that, right? And so it is in that moment I was like, we can unintentionally center whiteness unconsciously, even as Black people, white people, Asian, Latin, don't matter, because that's how colonization works. I did not learn that in nutrition or public health. But it's so critical to understand how power plays out and the connection to the motherland in which we have an opportunity to reconnect and heal wounds, reclaim our foodways, restore our health by returning to our roots. That's the essence of the work of WANDA, and what I think of is so critically needed, because at the end of the day, if we focus only the mind, the body, but not the spirit, then we can lose the connection of what our ancestors brought us forth here for. And I'm always thinking about how my ancestors have moved, my father has moved me and opened up doors and protected me when so many times that I could have been snatched into the shadows of darkness. And I think this is the context in which we lose sight of in this space, and I hope we find a way to use language and words to center it. And so that is why we've moved forward with the importance of changing the environment by changing the narrative. And sometimes if that means we leave a few people behind, as Harriet said, then we got to do what we got to do, because we have a promised land to get to by any means necessary.
Wow. This is just unfair. I feel like I don't have enough time to go where I want to go in with this conversation. There's so much, Tambra. I mean, I just am sitting with, obviously, your context of lens being a fifth generation Oklahoman, and how you saw yourself in that space, living in the margins there, and your journey as you left Oklahoma, and all the ways that you are embracing the need to center Black people, Black women, and the narratives that have been playing out over the years that continue to not do that, even when you think you are leading movements that are trying to address things that impact Black communities. And so I think that the work around narrative change, love the fact that everything I saw as my weakness became my superpower. You know, as you think about the things you were running from or didn't want, and then now that serves as the power of what you're saying there. And I just so many things I want to talk about. I just appreciate. Let me just say I appreciate each of you, and don't feel like I got enough time. But let me do my part. I'm going to tell my story as well. That connects a little bit to all three. So I'm also a first generation American, a person that grew up here in Washington, D.C. My grandmother came to the country in early 1960s from Guyana in South America, which is considered the Caribbean, although it's on the continent of South America, but it's part of that the Caribbean culture. And my mom was one of 9 kids, but she was the youngest of 9. And I had 5 aunts and 3 uncles on that side. My dad was one of 10, also Guyanese. And so when they came to the country, my grandmother was a teacher. She also played the piano at her local church in Guyana. And so those were her 2, wanted everyone to be educated and wanted everyone to walk with a strong faith. And learn music. So that was kind of the 3 things that were kind of embedded to us as kids growing up. And so growing up here in Washington, D.C., my mom also moved, all of my aunts moved. So my family, my circle was, first of all, that's just like rare now that you could have all 9 kids could kind of move to the country versus the dynamics of how that was playing out. So that was in the 60s. I was born in the 70s. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., grew up in what I considered, what was just, I thought everyone lived in a DC, right? You had amazing, a range of Black excellence, and you had low income, you had middle, you had upper middle. And so I grew up in that kind of environment. I was definitely on the lower middle growing up in that space. But when I went to school here in DC, you started to see with a lot of the predominantly white schools, you started to see a lot more I started to see the difference between, where I was growing up versus where a lot of, where my white classmates were growing up. Like there was another part east of the park, of Rock Creek Park, like, oh, there's a different way folks living over here than I was used to in other parts of DC. So I obviously started to notice that. Was trying to figure out, put words to my life in terms of where I wanted to fight the fight in social justice. I went to Gonzaga, which was a predominantly white school here, Jesuit school. Tried to fight. There was no African-American history class. I was one of a few of us that were trying to fight to get African-American history class when I was there at Gonzaga. We won my senior year. We finally got a teacher and that was like those small wins. So I decided to go to Howard University for HU in the house, So went to Howard with the goal of really wanting to be more intentional about understanding my Blackness, understanding my voice, and where I wanted to show up. So I was very intentional about. But I also was a violinist. So I grew up playing the violin. I was concert master, DC Youth Orchestra, played a lot of solos at the Kennedy Center. I was pretty good. Pretty good. And that was one of those things growing up where when people saw you, it's like, here's this tall, big black guy can pick up the violin and play a concerto. It was like, whoa, that's like messed up your whole stereo kind of style. And then it was always very just amazing to watch how people would react to you when you were able to do that. So that was a part of me growing up. But going to Howard also not only helped me find my voice, it also helped me find my the person I now call my wife, that we've been now married 22 years. She went to Georgetown, though. And so she was at Georgetown. She was from Queens. Her parents are from Trinidad and St. Vincent. All right, so Trini's in the house. So we were friends during that period of time. One of those, like, I was dating, she was dating, I liked her, she didn't like her. It's one of those, for those that are in that space for those 4 years. But Howard was my starting point for me really trying to pursue my career. I left. I went to Pittsburgh. When I was in Pittsburgh, I went to Carnegie Mellon for my master's at the Heinz School. I got very involved, and I realized when I got to Pittsburgh ain't no DC. That was a shock for me, because all my life I thought DC was, and realized there are more Pittsburghs in the world than there are DCs in the world. So that was a moment for me, like, wow. And I showed up in Pittsburgh in the 90s when they were going through a transition similar to like a Detroit. The steel industry had just left the area. They were trying to figure out, and everybody was poor, but black people were a lot poorer, right? So the median income, I remember, there was, like, blowing my mind. It was like something like 20,000 was the median income for the average person, and for black people was 12,000. And I was like, that was blowing my mind coming from DC. It's like, but that was like very real in terms of like, what do we do? What's the plans and the strategies? And here I am, same thing, going to Heinz School, thinking about, well, what's the policy things and the data we need to be doing? And so I was out there in that same space working with a black women economist, Dr. Susan Williams McElroy, who's now in Texas. And she was helping me understand how to do the research, we put out some good published pieces, and then I started working in the community called Homewood Rushden, which was a predominantly black neighborhood, trying to get a sense of what the work is, how to organize. Ended up working after I graduated at the local Allegheny County Department of Health and Human Services, doing some work around youth that were transitioning out of foster care. So they started to try to do the work and try to figure out a way to make a difference. And then I wanted to go deeper on the research is when I went to go to Michigan to pursue my PhD in urban planning at the University of Michigan. So I showed up in the early 2000s. Detroit, got a chance to appreciate, at that point, Detroit it's a skeleton of itself, right? In the early 2000s, and they trying to figure out, I'm just coming from Pittsburgh, seeing like there's another Detroit that's kind of navigating through the same, and so I'm wrestling with the work that needed to be done, and the role that I could play in all of that, in doing that work. So I was in there working on my PhD, came back to DC because of the work I was doing around youth development. I was still in this, like, okay, if we can really get people to understand how to define it, how to understand the data and disaggregate it, like I was still in that space, like I was still trying to convince that the research would lead us down the road. And so I went to work for the Forum for Youth Investment, Karen Pittman, amazing woman that's doing youth development work. And so she invited me to do a fellowship. And while I was there, I had a chance to find a job at the National League of Cities as Director of Youth Development. So youth development was my thing. National League of Cities was like the career for me, working with local leaders across the country to try to change policy, try to convince them of here's what every young person needs. And I quickly learned, that's when I started to realize, people ain't really committed to do it. Like, this ain't, like, I'm working with mayors. It's like, I got this definition. I know what the data is. We can do this work. And it's like, no. It's like you realize all the resistance. And then you have to realize, how then do I build strategies to convince what needs to happen with these mayors to get this work done? And so there are all different ways that you were learning about how to do it. And along the way, I still wasn't naming race. Right. I want to be very clear. I was doing the work and not talking about racial equity. In fact, I was avoiding it. Because I was dealing with these men, it's like, I don't know if I want to bring that into the room. Let me find other ways to talk about it and do the work. And I was committed to doing it, feeling like I was getting good traction. Robert Wood Johnson was an example. They were doing childhood obesity work. That was one of the work we were doing with mayors. I was doing Invest. I started in 2005, and they had this big goal of reversing childhood obesity by, 2016 or something like that? They invested $500 million, and we were getting all these mayors to, to understand, like, it's not just a personal responsibility. We got to change policy, complete streets policies, land use policies, and we were all celebrating that. 10 years doing that work. all $500 million spent. And RWJF brought us into Philly to kind of measure the impact, which is kind of the work I do now, the impact of our investment. And are we seeing childhood obesity rates reduce? What did they find? Well, early adolescence, it was starting to decline. Middle adolescence, it was plateauing. Late adolescence, it wasn't spiking as much. And when we were seeing that research, we all started celebrating. Like, yeah, we finally did. And then someone asked the question, is it going down for everybody? Come on now. And it was a silence in the room. And they didn't have an answer to the question. So when they went back and looked, what did they find? For Blacks, Indigenous, and Hispanics, it was spiking even worse. So you could change overall childhood obesity, but exacerbate the problem. Like, that was my first, like, what the hell have I been doing? You don't talk about this work. You're not intentional about this work. You cause more harm. So I have to find myself to figure out, I got to change that equation. What's the role I play? And so that's my pivot, was starting to lead the work at NLC at the time around our racial equity, racial justice. It happened after the killing of Michael Brown, Ferguson being a member of NLC. We didn't have a response to all of the racial responses that were happening after the killing. We started engaging with leaders around, how do you have these conversations around racial equity? How do you normalize it? How do you operationalize? How do you organize? And started to really figure out how to do that work, that training, the technical assistance, the policy, the planning. And then 2020, the summer of 2020, all of us saw the killings and the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Walter Wallace. We all saw what happened and all the promises that were made. And everybody was interested now to do this work. And the question for me is, where are we now? You know, as I now lead Equal Measure, the journey for me is getting more specific about what does that look like? What is the tangible things that we know we're actually making a difference? And so I end my personal story is, I grew up here on Jefferson Street. I married my wife in 2002. I'm still living in the same house I grew up in. And my grandmother's piano is still there, and her rocking chair is still there, and we have 3 daughters. That's our legacy. And so we left 4 weeks ago, to go to Ghana to go to Africa for the first time as a family. We were in Ghana for 2 weeks. It is a trip I wish everyone could take in their lifetime. And when I talk about the transformational piece for me, my kids, to be able to understand the narratives that we talk about. For 400 years, we saw the slave dungeons, the male dungeons, and the women dungeons, and the disparities, and the church that was built on top of the dungeons that could hear the sounds of Black men in those dungeons. And you're worshiping a God for 400 years that tells you that's okay. To see the river that my ancestors walked for their last bath before going to those crazy dungeons, to be able to stand in that river, to know I brought my ancestors back, that they never thought that they would return back. And I am the representation of them, and my kids are the representation of us surviving all of that. Brings me a lot of pride. I wear this with pride. Understanding that history. These are the narratives for me that gives me the confidence of why we need to be committed to doing this work and be committed to doing it in a very tangible, concrete way. But that's our commitment here. I wish we had more time. I wish we had more time. But what I do want to pivot to is to take a moment to be able to, each of you, for me, to give a concrete example and a story, if you can tell it in a story kind of way, of where you feel transformation actually has happened. And I want to be very clear in the audience, and Dr. Gale is not here. We make a distinction between change and transformation. And so when we talk about transformation, that change is like tinkering around the edges, maintaining status quo. Transformation is something that is truly getting to what a system needs to look like to serve everybody. And so I'm curious, and I want to acknowledge, we don't have a lot of good examples of that. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but it's also helpful to know if there are good examples of where we could build from as we think about what that is. And so I want to give our panel a chance to be able to share that example, and then we're going to break up into tables to have a little more one-on-one conversations with y'all. So who would like to go first? All right, Tambra.
I don't mind going first. So as I shared, I been living in DC since graduating from TESMED, and in that time period, I joined the DC Food Policy Council as an appointee, and just my term has ended this year. And in that time period, and why even the council even came to be, imagine the market meat quote of a few dedicated citizens coming together, what could we do? And so many of us was working on food policy before there was ever a council. And then we were able to monitor and see, we have a Detroit food policy, we have Oakland, we have LA food policy. And so getting into that space of policy, systems, environment shift. And in the time period, other organizations thought maybe they didn't need to be in the room anymore since the cavalry was here. But what I knew from even just being in a military town, you literally need all forms of national security defenses. Army can't do Navy, Navy can't do Marines, and Marines can't do Air Force. So everyone has their superpowers. So that became clear in the context of the Food Policy Council and the working groups that we had covering sustainable ag to workforce, to nutrition and health, to food business. Like, all these different areas were critically important in addressing food systems. But what was clear was that only food economy related work seemed to matter. Nutrition and health was kind of like, again, at the margins, like Black women. And so I knew that place so well, so I knew the need to advocate. And now it's getting its shine in terms of the 1115 Medicaid waivers and what that can mean for the food as medicine space. And so in that time period, the Newark DC Fund came about, which was BIPOC funding, $1 million. Yeah, it could be more, but it was a way to make those investments into those BIPOC food businesses that we know, like a Dreaming Out Loud, like Fresh Fruit Factory, like a Market 7 in Ward 7. So many different businesses that needed access to capital, they needed competency, they needed community, and they needed opportunity. And understanding that when you collect data in a way that can be a tool of liberation, it has the opportunity to take data to turn them into dollars, and those dollars be put in the hands of the community. And this is at a time when everyone was either for or against Walmart's moving into the DC. Four were promised, never happened. We got two, and we know how that bamboozlement happens. Promise one thing, pull the rug just so you can get what you want. But I knew from having worked in the social entrepreneurship space with local economies that if you invest in people from the community, they're the anchors that the community will rely on. They're the ones who see the importance to stay in community. So to me, it's like, this should be common sense. If you're betting on a big box, they only have one bottom line, which is upward mobility growth, double-digit increases. Not that a Safeway and Giant can't be in a Ward 7 and 8. They're not making the profit at the level that they want. They look at master's degrees to determine what the economic opportunity is for them. When you position food in a capitalistic commodified lens, you'll always have hunger in this country. And that is how in which we have come in the pandemic to finally shine a spotlight on food and nutrition security, and why now the Right to Food movement that I'm now a part of is growing, because of this understanding that in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right to food, like right to health, one, for me, they're all the same. It's all connected. But the other part, in this country, we've not signed one on the UN declarations, let alone on this issue of right to food. But it's a movement that's in UK, it's in India, and we just met up in Syracuse for the second time as a large gathering, and every one of us are looking at how do we pull legislation together to say right to food should be a right to people in our cities, in our towns, in our states, in this country. And that is why now Food Bill of Rights is a concept that we as WANDA have put forward and have been galvanizing energy around, have had it as a priority item within our DC Food Policy Council, how right to food is now a cross-cutting measure of how we think about food, because in the Food Bill of Rights for us, it serves as an umbrella framework that takes a public health approach which is not common in food. Farmers over here, nutritionists over here, chefs over there, health providers over there. And I'm saying just like national security systems, we should all have a coordinated system that's not fragmented. That means bringing people together to understand every one of you play a role in this system, in this pipeline, and how do we make sure that we're all on board, understanding, value, and appreciating the roles in which we play, and that all of us should be shifting our identities to see ourselves not as foodies on Instagram, but as food citizens who are participating in a food democracy and building a better, inclusive, equitable food system. And that's what we put the beacon of light on to shine. That is the eye on the sparrow for us, is this belief that we deserve a right to food. It's so easy that because we have access to a Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks that this is food. But as we've noticed, if you're following anything online, you realize quickly, like, you can be hoodwinked and bamboozled with frankenfood. And just because it's edible does not mean it's nutritious. And so for me, it's understanding the power of food science and technology. A lot of things that people just don't get training and understanding. And so this is the space of me, is like having come out of food science, nutrition science, appreciating that space, but also knowing the role that they have a moral ethical dilemma in this space around how do we make food in a way that truly is nutritious, delicious for the community, that our food, African, Caribbean, diasporan foods, should also be our medicine just as much as the Mediterranean food, and therefore it needs research dollars invested. And if we have a food bill of rights, it understands that the importance of narrative, the role of food sovereignty, the importance of climate and sustainability connected to food. Like, all these things would be literally a walking piece of manumission papers that we would know this is our pathway to freedom, is through the power of food.
So I love that. So let me just name how I heard it as I think about transformation and wonder how it's landing in the room. But as you talk about the right to food and the food bill of rights, the way you've talked about the food bill of rights, the need to coordinate these systems, and it's not fragmented, and how people see themselves as food citizens, not foodies, and the framing of the food bill of rights and the way you're describing it is an example of what transformation could look like.
Right.
The work that still needs to happen is getting governments and trying to figure out how we fully implement this food bill of rights into the systems and what it looks like to coordinate that in DC or other places across the country. Maybe there's a coordinated federal, state, local, but the coordination of all that is still needed to happen for it to fully be transformation.
Right, and it can be a toolkit for local food policy councils. So like going back to Oklahoma and even in Dallas where I grew up, there's no food policy council. So this is why I love history. So when you think about grievances in the making of a U.S. Bill of Rights or Declaration of Independence, you had some white men from Europe say, I'm pissed as hell, I'm leaving this place, I'm making my own spot. And then they're going to throw a framework together and to declare these truths to be self-evident. I mean, that's powerful, right? The power of imagination. And so my thought is, why not take that same energy and apply this to food and say, we all got some grievances against the food system, so why don't we come up with our own declaration, peace out, because that's what governance is about. That's what power to the people looks like. This room right here could be forefathers of a food bill of rights, right? And we can just all sign our little John Hancock and push forward and pump it through the news, because the news is all about the fourth estate of creating a space of that discourse in order to shape policy, and therefore the people in power have nothing but to listen to the people who are truly in power, which is us. And that's part of the game, is to believe that you're not powerful, but you are powerful beyond measure. And that's to me why controlling your mind and all things that flow in it and into your body is so fundamentally important. So many people give up hope, but it's that hope that we need to take us to the ballot box in November. It's that hope that we need that says helping other people every day. It's that hope we need that says having optimism and perseverance and enthusiasm when everybody want to sling dope, which is doubting other people every day. That's what we need to do, is have more hope.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Tiffany, you want to share a specific example?
Yeah, and I think, what I love about the question is because I think that we are so accustomed to thinking that we're losing because what you see on the news doesn't reflect kind of the sort of ground truth thing that we know is happening in communities, and so we don't often take the time to actually celebrate what is happening that's winning. So I love the question. I'm going to take a different tack, one that's not a kind of conversation that was not built sort of ground up, but was built sort of a sort of movement that was started in a different kind of way, but it's really been important and impactful in terms of moving capital in a way that's really been important, that we don't always give a lot of power to, but is really important. And that is thinking about just the social determinants of health overall, that as a common framework for thinking, just broadly construed about our health system, is super duper important, and has been super important for a number of reasons. The reason I want to start there is because that conversation certainly started in community, but sort of graduated to lots of folks in philanthropy. Barbara Johnson Foundation has been really a major sort of sponsor and partner in that. I would say a number of philanthropic organizations were saying, listen, we're looking at the numbers, and where health is happening is in community. It's not in doctors' offices, but how do we figure out how to help people understand that, so that the resources stop being spent in doctors' offices and start being spent in community. And a part of the strategic conversation was a lot of polling and, how do you get people to lean into that? Not just folks in community, but how do you get institutions to move dollars like that? And so a whole, coordinated campaign around, after much polling and some of it not very helpful, but some of it helpful, just talking about this narrative around our zip codes, that our zip codes determine that our health is more determined by the zip code in which we live in than our genetic code, which, when you think about that in and of itself, right, was, in and of itself was a way to try to get around what you described early on, Leon, is happening, which is the moment you named race in some of those conversations, people lost interest, right? In terms of the institutional conversation, not philanthropy, but I'm talking about the institutions that govern healthcare in America and a series of other institutions. Same thing happened in the pandemic. Everybody was all gung-ho for solving the pandemic until they realized that disproportionately black folks were passing away, and then all of a sudden people lost interest, didn't want to mask up, didn't want to do a whole lot of stuff. And we had to grapple with that. Like, we want to tell the story of what's happening in the community, but once we start to tell that story, the institutions that marshal resources kind of walk away, because it's just those people. Whatever. So a part of the conversation on zip code was to say, we need to have this conversation about race, but we don't want people to walk away initially. Can we at least have a narrative that talks about place? And then we can name not just race, but a number of things that are impacting that. It's housing, it's, transportation, it's childcare, it's all the things that actually determine health, and being able to do that. I don't know that we've really grasped as a field how instrumental that has been. I can tell you from the institutional structural vantage point, that conversation is moving more resources than we had ever seen back into community, and actually forcing institutions that never wanted to work together for the betterment of community into community in ways they had not understood. I work a lot, for example, with the housing finance agencies, which are responsible for about 95% of all the affordable housing that's built in the country today, because they, as they say, they control the coins, right? A lot of them are now partnering at the state level with hospitals, healthcare institutions, talking about doulas and all kind of stuff they never talked about before, because they have a common agenda. You probably can even speak more to this, which is what's driving healthcare costs are the challenges that are happening in the social determinants, not in the health in the doctors community. What's driving that is what's happening in terms of the lack of healthy food, as you're talking about. And so now billions of dollars are being shifted. Now, not all that money is coming where it's supposed to be, but that initial shifting of consciousness from where health is actually happening has been huge for us, and it continues to happen, right, in the ways that are really super important. And it's driving what I would call other solidarity movements around that, because the framework of that, talking about our zip code, well, what the hell, how do we even get to this point, right? If you think about redlining it, how do we even get to the point where whole communities, right, are looking very differly, and it's driving a larger conversation that I think is enabling the healthcare folks to talk to the housing folks, and the housing to talk to education folks. Like, we all are in the same boat, but how do we shift the investments in community in a way that allows us to act in greater solidarity? So I want to really lift that up in terms of what is actually happening, that's shifting resources in a way that's much more aligned with community, and how do we leverage more of that, right, to make sure that that's happening. So that's just one example I give.
No, and we need to hear that from time. I think when we're doing this work, it's hard to overlook some of the success that you've had when you talk about narrative. You know, to get to the place where we are talking about social determinants of health,
Right.
and looking at health beyond just an individual responsibility of people that are in healthcare, but it's education, it's housing, it's all of it. And then to be able, that's been transformational, right? In the sense of there's definitely more people that see that at that level. And then even the zip code, zip code a determinant of your health. Yeah, so I'm sitting with it. I'm almost trying to be convinced as you are, as you're saying. It's like, yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, I always want more, right? As I think about, yeah, that's true, because you need to change narrative to kind of build off of it. You got to change investments. So I'm holding that, and I appreciate you naming that and bringing that in space. So Avenel.
Yeah, I too really appreciate that. I mean, I think the thing that I love the most about working at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is that we do have a broad viewpoint of health. Our vision is that health can be not just a privilege for some, but a right for all. And I think for us as an institution, we've recognized that a real barrier to that is structural racism. And we've named it as such. And to your point earlier, it shifts the way in which you analyze the system. It shifts the type of work that you do and support once you have named and you've centered structural racism as being a precipitating factor to it. So to get to your original question, some of the transformation, I think that in of itself is transformational. I'll say that. I think RWJF, we work across multiple systems. I think we need to not sort of lull ourselves into thinking that structural racism is a vestige of the past, that, you have these redlining laws that were passed many, many years ago, and it's just a thing that we're dealing with. It's actually an active thing that's happening every day. Their structural racism is embedded in our systems. It is being reinforced every day. It is being experienced every day. This is showing up in particular in anti-DEI laws, in laws around divisive concepts or anti-equity laws that are happening on the state level that significantly impact our ability to tell the truth about impacts on health from the social determinants. And so some of the transformational work that we've been doing at RWJF is visualizing those attacks. We see them, they are actively happening, coming up and supporting litigation strategies, so that litigation, y'all, is really expensive, right? And so when these laws are being passed and there are organizations that are trying to push back against them, those are not the highly financed organizations, right? And so what ends up happening is the judicial doctrine leans towards one that doesn't allow you to consider race or to consider the intersectional aspects of race in developing policy. So that's some of the work that we're doing. Some of the work around narrative. I think this is incredibly important. Again, when you talk about anti-DEI laws, you can overlay that with the increased ideological splits that are happening across the country, which is reinforced by the lack of local news media, trusted news sources that have primarily been bought up by private interests, private equity firms, meaning that the story and the information that people are receiving, what is shifting the way in which they're thinking about issues is controlled with a anti-equity lens. And so some of the investments that we're making is in local news system, in the ecosystem of media, training reporters and journalists on even how to do an analysis in their work about how structural racism is showing up, so that they're not just coming at it from a disparities framework. We know the data, we know Black people are dying more, we know that they have more chronic disease, but why? Why is that happening? And how do we explain that in a way that people can really understand and take that information and do something with it? I think the one thing that I'd love to leave, and I know we're running out on time, is we are living in laws and policies that were designed by people. These were intentionally designed to subjugate some and allow for the flourishment of others. That is something that can be redesigned by people. And it is not something that's going to happen in 5 or 10 years. This is generational work. but it is the work that you all are doing in communities, it's the work you're doing in your institutions that will further us to that. And it's not hopeless. It is hard, but it is not hopeless. And we can co-create a future where everyone is thriving.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. One of the things that stood out to me, I'm sitting with too, with when you talk about transformation, is transformation even within RWJF.
Oh, for sure.
Because for those that have been around and even seen RWJF's journey, when I was at the National League of Cities, naming racism was not a thing. You did not touch that thing when you talk with RWJF and the board. The fact that y'all are so boldly now talking about structural racism, and I know we're working with y'all now too, and you're leaning in on that as you think about everything, your well-being and all the things. That for me is transformation within a foundation, particularly when we know that there's so many that are backing away from the fight. Right? So I just want to appreciate you naming that, because that is really important to name. So we blew up the whole agenda. I just want to acknowledge that. My bad, I'm as a facilitator, but as you know, this is rich. So what I was going to suggest, rather than doing the breakouts, we only got like 20 minutes. So let's just open it up for people in the room for conversations. I see a hand already. So yes, ma'am. Introduce yourself too.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Miller. I'm the cohort one, and I have two questions, and I apologize for getting both of them. But one in terms, so I have one question on justice, and one question on bureaucratic. The bureaucratic one, because I'm experiencing that, what happens when you get an administration that is for you, but you have bureaucrats who are slow walking all the while they're glad handing. We switch, you move them against this. I work for it, and then slow walk everything. So, and then also something like the these reports, like how do we as movements start to get at those procedural things that affect all of this. And then with the food justice, I wondered, is this also working on, like, how is it working on monopolism, and how do we support monopolism within the food industry, increasing monopolization? So those are.
Well, I'm happy to start with the question on bureaucracy, and that speaks to a lot of the work that I do at TheCaseMade. A part of the reason that I founded TheCaseMade was because we were having lots of conversations in communities about changing the narrative, but most of the folks who were in the conversation about how to move, trying to vision forward, didn't actually know how the systems actually worked, and so they were asking the folks to give them something that they were not even able to give. Like, you're asking somebody to give you something that they're not even authorized to give you. You can ask all you want to, and they might even agree to it, but when they go back right to whoever their bosses are, whatever organization they're at, they don't have the authority to give you what you need. So part of it was, and I think one of the sisters talking about this morning in terms of just power mapping. Where is the money in the system? Who reports to who? And there's formal authority and there's informal authority, right? And so who are the folks who are formally in charge of institutions that we know of? And then who are really the folks who influence that conversation? The TheCaseMade, we were recently, and I won't name the city, but a young, fantastic, young African American mayor, for the first time.
To like 10.
Right.
You're right. Take that off the table. But just got elected. We've been working with the whole coalition in that city to do a lot more equity-focused work in community. Got elected. Having a great time, just really talking to folks and being excited about what's possible. Then he gets the call that says, yeah, you might have gotten elected, but all that equity talk, stop it. Like, we're not going to support you if that's the conversation. Like, we want to do a lot. We can do a lot with you, but the moment you start talking that equity, we're going to pull the support around what the city needs to thrive. So, and he was like, Okay.
I'm gonna talk to you on the side. I need to know
Yeah.
these layers.
Okay. So there's a whole different level of
That's real.
authority in places, and sometimes we aren't privy to that. So we think the object of the game is to get the mayor elected. That has some levels of authority, but there's a whole different. And so having that conversation up front with community. Listen, what do we know about formal power in this community? What do we know about informal power? And then what's the power that we have in community, right, to begin to change, right, and infiltrate some of those conversations. The second thing I would say, just in terms of thinking about, bureaucratic shift, is we have to actually figure out how to actually make a case for the thing that we actually want to happen. But because we often don't know how those systems actually operate, we don't even know what we're making the case for. You may say the vision is that everybody have a great food system, that we do. The vision is this, but what is the thing that you actually need to shift to have transformational change? And a part of the challenge is being able to identify what is it this institution works with that institution. Is it that we need to dismantle those institutions and create another one? That process of having us have the space and time to think about what it is we're actually asking for and who we need to champion that is the space that we don't often get to have, because we're often so reactionary, just trying to react to the next thing that happened on the news. You see some crazy, you're like, wait a minute, I was doing this, but I need to stop and go protest because that's crazy, right? And so the space that you actually need to create the not just the longer term vision, but the intermediary steps to get there doesn't often happen. And I would say take some time, figure out whether they're foundations or other philanthropic organizations who will sponsor the space that you need to do that level of thinking about what's the case you're actually asking for in this moment that helps you get there. And now, who want to jump in?
No, I was going to add to that, in terms of the power mapping. Advocates often don't do enough of the counterintelligence. There are forces that don't want the thing that you're asking for. Why? Who doesn't want it? What is driving them? Where does the money sit? How do you disrupt that flow? How do you appeal to what it is that they essentially want? Those are all questions that are really important to ask as you're coming up with your case that's going to be most successful in trying to navigate whatever political system that you're operating in.
And one last part about that, which you really talked about, just the data and the reports that get driven. All these bureaucratic agencies, like they already collect data that supports the status quo, and they push that data out constantly. And the thing that's interesting for us is, like, it's almost like clockwork. Every year the COC numbers, the continuum of care, that's just one example, come out every year where they go and do point in time count of all the folks who are homeless in a community. They push out this crazy data once a year because they went around and counted people on the street, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I'm like, what in the world? And they push it out. Oh my God, it's awful, right? Which doesn't do anything to help, right? The work that we're trying to do to address issues of homelessness. So if we know that it's coming, right? Talk about counterintelligence. If we know that it's coming, then a part of it is our opportunity and responsibility. It's going to be on the nightly news. It's going to be in the newspaper. That we develop a way of responding to that says, we get those numbers, but here's what we're doing in this community because this is the work that actually matters. And so that's a part of a counter, I would say, offensive around that kind of work. The welfare dependency report comes out every year and it's going up to Capitol Hill. What's our counter to that speaks to the specific case that we're building to do something different, right? So if we know that, let's get real smart about that. That's a moment to leverage the kind of conversation. Last thing I'll say about that, and not just the grants pass decision that just came out with respect to homelessness, came out in important, essentially ruled last 2 or 3 weeks ago that you don't have a right to the sidewalk. If you are homeless and you're on the sidewalk, that local communities, like DC and every other large community where they're having increasing numbers of folks on the street who are homeless, that police have the right to come and arrest you, right, and criminalize the activity of sleeping on the street because you don't have it, right, because you're homeless. And we don't offer anything better, but that's okay. You can't sleep there, right? You might sleep in the jail, but you can't sleep on the street. And so the Supreme Court going to do what it's going to do, right? That bless their little hearts. Every week they come out with something crazy, and it gets crazier every week. Like, the president has immunity to do anything he wants to, don't matter what. Okay, when we go there. But the thing about it is, what is the power that we have, right, to address that? Every single community across the country gets a reporter coming to you, sticks a microphone in your face, right, to say, what do you think about what the Supreme Court did? don't take the time to talk about the sidewalk. We don't want the sidewalk, right? Nobody said we want the sidewalk. What we want is folks to have a decent place to live in a community that's thriving and with dignity, right? Right, and we want that regardless of who you are, but especially for folks who have not benefited from the kind of resources we put in housing before. That's the moment to take the time to say, right, to have a different kind of conversation, a different narrative that we start to say, not in reaction to the craziness of the Supreme Court, but because this is a narrative that reinforces what we need in our communities. And that's the leveraging of the moment in a lot of spaces, not only in food security, insecurity, however you want to talk about it, housing, just whatever it is. That's the moment I think we have right now. I'll stop there. And then the other question.
Let me make sure Tambra does the second question was around food justice and how does it work in the context of anti-monopoly at grocery store, superstores, and food production.
No question. I wanted to touch on a food case study related to the counterintelligence work they're talking in and weave in your question next. Prior to working on our food policy council, we were working to get a soda tax passed, like many cities. Mexico has done a stellar job on these issues, as well as the right to food issue. What we did not factor is that just up the street we have American Beverage Association, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, like literally at our doorsteps. And so when I tell you, I will never forget, it's almost like PTSD, like your do-gooder activities are countered with this fake grassroots campaign funded by ABA, putting in soda bottle ads in front of the big chair, like in Anacostia where I live, like it was like the iconic black scene is like this chair. And to say like they're taking the soda away from me, as a black person, like first we ain't got much. So the little bit we get, like food and beverage, like, no, you're not taking that away from me. I mean, talk about powerful framing. And as it's these moments that has led me to media and communication as a social determinant of health. And when I began to realize, like, how many people did you pay to throw on a red t-shirt to roll up in DC City Council to have this fake rioting, it was just like, could we not have seen that? And to then also see the scattering of Coca-Cola cans on the council members' table, mostly the black ones, and having the whites actually fight for the community. That was like a mind-blown moment. So when I talk about like neoliberalism, or a white Republican down south almost vote no differently sometimes than black Democrats up north, I'm like, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It was in that moment where I realized that economic jobs, that conversation, like trumps health every day. No pun intended, but it's just true. And in that moment, I realized, like, if we're not framing in the language that politicians understand, which is like votes and political and economic power, because what's influencing them are the donors, literally the donors, and they're just a puppet. So unfortunately, that's what it looks like, unless they actually have their own pool of money, and why they're sometimes in the position to get that pool of money. That's how you realize the Red Summers post Spanish flu, like this is what all it was about, like going into black communities like Foley and having Jim Crow laws to break up black economic political power and not have it concentrated. And anything that we ever forget to lose in that, I tell you, like, this is why we have to have history books. Like, I have no TV, I have nothing but bookcases in my house. Because if we think about statistics, do we know where it's rooted from? Eugenics. And so if we're tracking data, understand we're tracking data because there's this thought that you're naturally going to die off black people. Like, that is the thought post-emancipation. And therefore, this right to health is rooted in racism. If we believe you're inferior, therefore the data informs you're inferior, we don't need to give you anything to support your health because you're supposed to die off naturally anyway. So I'm confused to not understand this basic concept. Why? Because we're not being taught the history of race in America, in health, in this country. I mean, in my dissertation work, that's what I stumbled upon. And so for me, this is hence the role of Black women's societies came about to do the work, because they only cared about your Black health in adjacent to whiteness, because you might infect them with your infectious diseases. Therefore, we need to contain the virus and the disease of the Black community. Like, if we don't understand that, we're missing the whole point here. So your Black health only matters to you if you decide to care about it. So on the point about food, because we also use food in our Black community to be weaponized, Frederick Douglass writes about this in his memoir, My Bondage, My Freedom, published in 1855, about why liquor stores are in communities. Not only liquor was used to flow around Christmas time, is to inebriate you so you don't wander off and seek freedom. So how is that no differently than now? That's why I don't drink or smoke, period. People ask me, no, because I know the game, man. I know the game. Now, some people don't care, go right on ahead, but there's literally, like, alcohol, like, there's literally no health benefit to the alcohol. Like, it's just poison to the brain. Wendy Williams case study, alcohol-induced dementia. So for me, on this piece about monopoly and everything, monopoly matters in terms of what we value, right? And what we value is money and power, and people want concentrated power. If you do not want concentrated power, break up the power. Support those businesses, small businesses, Black businesses in your own community. Circulate the Black dollar, like Bowley was the example of. So this notion that Black people don't support, please stop saying that narrative. You feed right into colonization, divide and conquer, the oldest strategy. Please challenge the notions that we say in our minds, and I see it. I had one over the restaurant. I had to stop the Black man. Please stop that. Because if you know the issue where I come from, we support one another. Now, there's people who don't want us to support one another. Play right in and say, if you want to, keep putting your money into the companies that don't support you, that were back supporting slavery if you want to, but that's how it begins. Don't support people who are creating monopolies. It's really that simple. If you don't want it, redistribute your money. Sew your own damn clothes. Like, start walking. I mean, Rosa Parks did it. There was a whole concentrated movement of activism that said if we wanted to divest from the system, that's what sugar was about. And we remember before there was this, if you ever watch Amazing Grace, it was about Wilberforce in Parliament, in the British in Parliament, and he was just pontificating on, like, his moral dilemma of the slave trade and what could he do about it. And they understood that divesting, like, sugar and slavery were, like, intertwined. People died in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And so if we understand the importance of what products that have been killing Black people in the fields, and now we're dying from the diabetes, it's all connected. But we're not making these connections.
Well, absolutely. I was going to say just one last thing, just because I want some conversation, because not all of us are, in our work that we do, are talking to folks who get, like, this level of history, or who even are interested in the conversation, right?
No, you don't.
Right?
Okay.
Or these criminal, like, you know, the moment you start talking about these issues, like, critical race theory, right, and there's a
We're banning it.
right, we're banning it. Stop that. See, and then you get, like, and so it's harder to sometimes move some of these issues forward. So one of the things that I would say in the work that I do that has been really powerful is helping people to understand how to get people on what I call the racial runway. Like, you may be talking to somebody right now who doesn't even want to have a conversation about race, which is where you started talking before. It's all of our responsibility to get people on that runway. They may not be able to have the conversation we're talking about right here, which is all the way down and, like, listen, folks, we got racial capitalism, but let me tell you about structural racism. But they got to start somewhere, and it's our responsibility to help folks get on that runway and get all the way down. And there's steps on that. First, start to introduce this in those conversations. Even in I call them the suits. You're in the room with the suits. You got to just drop it in there, right? And sometimes you drop it in there in the most innocuous way. Like, I think we all should have this. We all should have that. The world, no matter what your race, no matter what your whatever, drop it into the conversation so it starts to get socialized in those rooms. And then as you start to hear folks thinking about that or repeating that back to you, because you've been saying it, right? They get, no matter what your race, you should be. Then move to the next level. Talk about the power differences or imbalances across those racial groups. But let me tell you, there's an imbalance of power. You look at landlords and renters. The reason our housing system looks the way it is because like there are power imbalances in terms of food security systems, right? And once you start to get people then parroting that, they'll say that, oh yeah, there are power imbalances. Then you start talking about what does it take to repair that? What is the racial equity policies that get to that? They may not be dismantle the whole damn thing and burn it down and start over, but they will say, okay, what are some of the things we can do today that start to shift those power imbalances? And as you get your stakeholders to do that, then you move them all the way down. Okay, now we're doing some of that right now. Let's go redress some of the crazy stuff that has already happened. And that means, unfortunately, dismantling a whole lot of stuff we put in place so that other things can be put in place that actually get us to a situation where we have racial justice.
And just to add on to this, I think it's really important for folks to understand the value of equitable policies.
Yeah.
Right? I think often you will say, look, here are these two differences. Native Americans and Black people don't have home ownership as much. So if we change this policy that helps to invest in this, it'll solve that problem for them. But what we're not saying enough of how does that make the system better for everybody?
Right.
Everyone benefits when we are able to make policies and laws that are more equitable. And that gets lost. Data bears that out in many cases, but it gets lost in the way in which we talk about the work. Absolutely. And it loses people from taking the journey. That's right. That you're describing.
It's a limited mindset. It's not thinking abundantly, right? In abundance, everyone has something.
It's scarcity versus
exactly,
mindset,
and that's why the mindset has to shift, and that's why we're investing in the next generation of media makers. I'm teaching media in the fall at AU to center these conversations around race and health, because at the NABJ conference, the Black journalists that I'll be heading to in Chicago in another week or two, we're still not there, even for Black journalists. They're still not thinking about the policy systems conversation on the issue of obesity, and that's one of the problems that we as media researchers now have to analyze and show, like, we need to shift the way in which this information is being framed.
So I'm looking at them with the eye of, we're at time. I'm realizing we're at time. And I also was reading around. I know people haven't wanted to get their hands up and wanted to ask questions. I'm looking at some of the faces that had their hands up and didn't get a chance. So I will what I want to do, one is I will officially adjourn. For those that have questions, just come, but we'll hang out here for a little bit if folks have some questions. So I want to be next for the panel. But if y'all could join me in just thanking our panel.